History of Religion in 5.5 Objects by S Brent Plate, Chapter 6. Bread. When I hear bread breaking, I see something else. It seems to me as though God never meant us to do anything else. So beautiful a sound. The crust breaks up like manna and falls all over everything. And then we eat. Bread gets inside humans. Daniel Berrigan, Jesuit priest and peace activist. Around the same time modern artists were taking sacred symbols such as crosses and turning them in profane ways, another artist, Sister Mary Corrita Kent, was working in reverse. She joined the Order of the Immaculate Heart of Mary in 1936, studied and then taught art, and eventually chaired Immaculate Heart College's art program in Los Angeles. From the 1950s onward, Kent created screen prints that expressed her devotion to her Christian faith and related interests in social justice. Buckminster Fuller and Charles and Ray Eames championed her work, and her college department hosted lectures by John Cage, Alfred Hitchcock and Jean Renoir. While Vatican II meetings were taking place, 1962-65, and the Church expressing an interest in situating Roman Catholic traditions more firmly within the modern world, Kent's work stood as an ideal example of how this could be achieved. In the era of Andy Warhol's soup cans, Madison Avenue's Mad Men, and growing critiques of the excesses of high capitalism, Kent simply suggested, we lift the common stuff out of the everyday and give it a place in our celebration. Her 1964 work, The Juiciest Tomato of Them All, repurposed a slogan from Del Monte canned tomatoes into praise for the Virgin Mary, Mary being the juiciest tomato. The piece pays homage to Warhol, while squeezing devotional purposes out of consumer goods and pop art. Slogans under Kent's gaze became parables. At the time of Kent's death from cancer in 1986, prominent Harvard theologian Harvey Cox opined, the world of signs and sales slogans and plastic containers was not for her an empty wasteland. It was the dough out of which she baked the bread of life. Like a priest, a shaman, a magician, she could pass her hands over the commonest of the everyday, the superficial, the oh-so-ordinary, and make it a vehicle of the luminous, the only, and the hope-filled. In his eulogy, Cox conjures Kent's 1965 silkscreen print, Enriched Bread, a work that borrowed its vibrant scheme and colour, its scheming and symbols from a package of Wonder Bread, and is overlaid with a quote from Albert Camus's essay, Create Dangerously. In so doing, Kent draws on Christianity's central ritual of Holy Communion, a rite of wonder, of enrichment. Enriched bread merges and mixes sacred and profane, high art and low, recreating commercial products for new contexts, for spiritual ends. All of which offers an enlivening way to approach the place of bread in religious traditions. Simple and standard as it is, bread is deeply complex and full of wonder. If you haven't tried making it at home, please do so. Now, in fact, for it is in the tactility of the ingredients, the robust scented space of the kitchen, the natural yet contained fermentation processes that one begins to appreciate the intricacy of this daily meal. Meat can be taken straight from the animal source and eaten with nothing more than a fire to roast it over. Apples and pineapples, grapes and carrots, almonds and pecans are eaten directly from their plant sources with little processed intervention. But the most basic bread derives from carefully cultivated species of particular grasses that are harvested, ground, mixed with other ingredients, formed and baked in ovens that have some consistency in temperature. Go to your refrigerator and pantry and you will find there no staple foods that are more elaborately made. Vary any of the ingredients of bread, even to a slight degree, and the end product will be different at each and every baking. One type of grain varies significantly in taste from another, just as the shape of the dough, the fineness of the flour, and the addition of eggs or fruits or nuts all transform the end product. The ingredients are under human control, but only to a degree. Climatic changes from season to season can affect the protein structures of the grain crops, as can humidity and heat levels while making the dough. And that's to say nothing about the cultural and religious divergences that go into making bread. Apollonia Polan understands that all these details better than almost any living person. She is the young CEO of what is probably the best-known, most respected bakery in Paris, possibly the world. Begun by her grandfather in 1932, Poilan Bakery now employs 160 people and grosses more than $80 million a year. Those around the globe who have fallen for the spells and smells of Poilan Bakery bread have it shipped to their homes by Federal Express. Poilan is a business in the middle of one of the most modern, fiercely secular cities the world has ever known. And yet, to hear Apollonia discuss the making and partaking of bread, one begins to find something like a sensual, mystical encounter. "You must listen to the breads," she says. In the bakery's training programs, bakers learn family secrets in ways perhaps akin to the ancient Abtinas family's secret incense recipes for the Jerusalem temple. And apprentices are taught to use eyes and ears as much as scales and clocks. She finds bread to be the perfect vehicle to talk about really essential things: a revolution, a religion, a theory. Bread's intimate sensuality leads quite naturally into the body politic. Like other sensual objects, bread turns the stuff of religion upside down, as Sister Corita Kent has provocatively suggested. Its ubiquity in space, its characteristically quotidian existence in time, would at first appear to be the opposite of the sacred. We are given our daily bread when we ask, people who work are breadwinners, and what could be more profane than wonder bread? But bread stirs wonder, works its magic, as its glutinous mass binds people together. It has done for many eons, and will likely continue to do so for years to come. Yet bread's omnipresent dimensions can be overrated, and we find that not all people have put the natural lands on which they live to the same agricultural uses. I'll point to several traditions' use of bread, though we will also come to realise that cross-cultural and interreligious studies have limits. While it is not as widespread as the other subjects in this book, I felt it important to include bread in part because it serves as a warning of sorts that actually none of these 5 objects should be discussed as being a universal aspect to religions and cultures. At the same time, we will see when sensual objects are introduced into new places, they remake practices and customs. Tradition is a story of changes as edible objects meet hungry bodies in novel circumstances, and there is little question that bread has changed the world. A history of religions is incomplete without it. Our oldest literature in the Western world offers proof of the more than 5 millennia-old existence of bread as a food for humans. Unearthed inscriptions indicate more than 40 varieties of bread were in use in ancient Egypt and more than 200 in Mesopotamia. Yet it is also clear in the beginning that bread is bound up with human identity, marking types of people as distinct from others. We eat this bread, not that. And ultimately as a sign of civilization. The great ancient Mesopotamian myth of Gilgamesh tells the story of the wild man Enkidu, who is transformed as he learns of the existence of bread and eats thereof, just as he learns about lovemaking. Significantly, bread is introduced to the man by a woman, Shamhat, who has knowledge about such things. And in both the Iliad and the Odyssey, the term bread-eaters is used to refer to humans in general. It is a sign of culture and juxtaposed with the lotus eaters and others who do not cultivate the land or work, who lose sight of the journey of life. Bread is a human invention, bound up with hard work and the establishment of civilized life. The Stone Age saw the emergence of Homo sapiens and the coextensive rise of religion, art, settled social communities and their related social codes, and the cultivation of plants. Historians have called this the Great Neolithic Revolution, and it enabled humans to get on with the business of culture and civilization, which invention lifted the human to abilities beyond other animals is disputed. The use of tools is clearly a vital one, but other scholars have recently argued that the ability to cook and bake, which presupposes tool use, are what prompted the evolutionary leap. Shifting from hunting and gathering to planting and harvesting specific crops, then turning these natural substances into something edible, allowed for a greater diversity of energy sources and allowed humans to eat lower on the food chain. Bread can be stored and transported and became an important source of carbohydrates and nutrients. In return, the grains that we grew influenced us. Grain growing and bread making allowed us and forced us to settle in particular places for long periods, all of which led to larger brain development. It is how and what we eat that makes our brains big, not so much how and what we think. Mythologically and historically, bread signifies the transition of cultures from hunter-gatherers who use meat and fats and beer to civilizations that cultivate the ingredients and processes needed for bread and oil and wine. Adam and Eve were hunter-gatherers. After the fall, Adam and Eve themselves became farmers, and Adam's curse was to have difficulty in raising crops and making bread. In the sweat of your face you shall eat bread till you return to the ground. For out of it you were taken. You are dust, and to dust you shall return. Their sons, Cain and Abel, were farmers. Cain raised crops and Abel raised animals. After the first murder occurring in the field, Cain went on to build a city. The move is from garden to field to city. Culture relies on agriculture. As an old Albanian proverb puts it, bread is older than man. Even the Middle Eastern cultures that were exceptional for not eating bread understood its significance. Due in part to arid land, amber waves of grain on a mass scale were not an option in ancient Arabia, though Arabians did eat grain smashed into a pancake and cooked on a heated stone, while others crumbled them into a broth. Bread, Arabic khubz, in the fuller, leavened sense of the term, was not widely available, and the expression bread eater was here used for people of some socio-economic status. This is partly why, in the Hadith, Muhammad speaks highly of bread. The sayings compiled by Muhammad al-Bakari quote the Prophet Muhammad. The planet Earth will be a bread on the day of resurrection. Bread will be one pleasure of paradise. Al-Bukhari continues his quotations of the Prophet, saying that Allah will turn the earth with his hand, like any one of you turn a bread with his hands while preparing the bread for a journey, and that bread will be the entertainment for the people of paradise. The existence of daily bread, especially because so many activities are needed to bring it from field to mouth, can be precarious. Droughts and floods, hail and fire can devastate an entire season's worth of food. So, empires that support massive distribution systems become crucial. Empires have risen and fallen on the basis of bread, on how well their people can be fed with the most basic of substances. Jump ahead a few millennia, and we find evidence of bread and civilization again pitted against the wilderness, only by this time the progress is not so welcome. Writing in The Atlantic in 1897, naturalist John Muir argued against the wholesale deforestation that was occurring across the North American continent at the time, turning nature into empire. In the midst of his objections, he lays it clear. In the settlement and civilization of the country, bread more than timber or beauty was wanted, and in the blindness of hunger, the early settlers, claiming heaven as their guide, regarded God's trees as only a larger kind of pernicious weed, extremely hard to get rid of. In Muir's account, bread stands for blind hunger, greed and gluttony, and operates as a synodoche for civilization as a whole. Civilization is human, but the trees are God's. Progress isn't all it's cracked up to be. Muir is responding to a time when European Christians colonised North America and their diets shifted. The richness of the continent's natural resources, abundant in fish, fowl and fertile soil, enabled indulgence. The excesses of eating reached such a degree that by the early 19th century, a number of evangelical reformers and revivalists began to talk about the morality of diets and seeking more austere approaches to food consumption. Among them was Sylvester Graham, a Presbyterian minister who lectured on healthy lifestyles, advocating fresh air, cold baths and hard mattresses, as well as abstaining from alcohol and tobacco use. Ultimately, he called for a move away from the meat and grease-heavy cuisine that had become the daily bread of Americans. Observing the diets of Native Americans and Pacific Islanders and biblical references to food, Graham became convinced that the best diets were based on bread, with fruit, vegetables and nuts supplementing the carb-rich staple. Not only would these foods be healthy, the eating of them also would curb enthusiasm for masturbation, which Graham believed was not only impure, but also would lead to blindness. Graham's arguments, especially laid out in his 1837 treatise on bread and bread making, saw natural ingredients as closer to God's own intentions, and coarse, dark bread was the closest to nature. At the time, across the Americas and Europe, dark breads were considered the stuff of peasants and the poor, while refined, heavily sifted flour was for refined people. It took alum and chlorine to peel away husks and germ, leaving a white but nutritionless, chemical-laden loaf. Against the established bread-making practices of his day, he used unsifted whole wheat flour without chemical additives. Championing the dark, coarse breads, Graham's flour was eventually solidified into little flat squares we now know as Graham crackers. Graham was the Dr. Atkins of his day, only with a reverse strategy of making carbohydrate and mineral-rich foods the base, and his influence was felt on many prominent people and institutions. The revivalist Charles Finney, a notable figure in the Second Great Awakening, became president of Oberlin College in his later years and incorporated Graham's vegetarian diet as the standard fare for students at Oberlin. Students and business people had their own preferences, however, and private boarding houses in town began offering hot meat-based meals that became popular with students, leading to Oberlin's eventual abandonment of the diet. Around the same time and place, and as a direct result of the Second Great Awakening, a wheat farmer turned Baptist minister named William Miller predicted the second coming of Jesus would occur on March the 21st, 1843. This was based on his extensive study of the numerology of the Bible. When the end did not come, he revised his calculations for October the 22nd, 1844. Time passed and the end of the world did not come on this date either, leading to what would become known as the Great Disappointment. Many of Miller's numerous followers lost faith, at least in his cause, and turned to the Shakers and other Christian groups for connection. However, one follower named Ellen G. White took up where Miller left off. Beginning at age 17, she had a series of visions that led her to believe worship services should be held on Saturday, not Sunday, and that God cared deeply for the human body, especially what goes into it. White's visionary leadership earned widespread respect, and out of her work, along with that of several others, the Seventh-day Adventist tradition was born. Initially influenced by Graham's diet, the Adventists to this day are vegetarian and place high value on exercise and general health. Holistic health is emphasised. White advocated good eating, and many of her writings deal with cooking and preparing foods in ways that are wholesome for both body and soul. For her, good food, such as whole wheat bread, she often mentions the importance of Graham flour, was essential as the basis for a healthy body. At the same time, bread remained a key metaphor of Jesus Christ himself, and the spiritual and physical dimensions coalesce through her teachings. One of White's later visions included a plan for a health centre, and soon the Adventists opened the Western Health Reform Institute in 1866 in Battle Creek, Michigan. In the generation following White, one Adventist named John Harvey Kellogg took White's ideas and practices further, becoming superintendent of the institute in 1876. When the building burned down in 1902, Kellogg and his brother had it rebuilt on a grander scale, renaming it the Battle Creek Sanitarium, a place that would be host to many famous people, including Henry Ford, Amelia Earhart, Mary Todd Lincoln, and Sojourner Truth, and playfully recounted in T.C. Boyle's novel The Road to Wellville. Around this time, Kellogg invented cornflakes, revolutionising the concept of breakfast as cereal grains were harvested and pounded into flakes that could be kept for longer periods. Kellogg and his brother ultimately founded the company that would become the world's second largest snack food seller, producing foods that are miles away from 19th century Adventist diets. At the end of a summer in the middle of my college years, I returned to my family home after spending 2 months in rural Kenya doing quasi-missionary work. I walked through our local grocery store in San Diego and gazed upon the rows and rows of cereal produced by Kellogg's, General Mills and Post, in their rainbow-coloured, enticing boxes full of sticky processed ingredients. In aisle 5, I had a slight meltdown, weeping at the choices, wondering why it is that I should have access to so much when others have so little. Danish philosopher Søren Kierkegaard once called anxiety the dizziness of freedom, and while he certainly was not talking about breakfast meals, it is not far removed from the emotional state many of us are left with in a land of too many choices. The cereal aisle is but one indicator of the ways we have moved from a mode of eating that is cultivated yet still reliant upon nature to one that relies on the massively produced, multi-layered packaging of food inside well-lit box stores, which leaves us with some real, some imagined but possible, and some imagined but impossible choices. The name cereal itself comes from the goddess Ceres, Roman pagan deity of agriculture. The first uses of the term cereal in English are found in the early 19th century, predating Kellogg's invention, but at the same time as dietary reforms were emerging. In her connection with growing grains, Ceres was also associated with fertility, not only of crops but also of people, and Ceres thus became linked with marriage ceremonies. Preceding Ceres was Demeter, the Greek grain goddess of Eleusis, also linked with fertility, agriculture and marriage. The Greeks believed she discovered grain, and she is typically depicted carrying stalks of wheat. The underground cult that grew up around Demeter became a key religious movement in Athens. The root of her name, Meter, means mother. Like many of the goddesses of the ancient world, she is the Earth Mother. In Norse mythology, we find the goddess Sif, the wife of Thor, playing the role of the Earth Goddess. Loki, the trickster, cuts her hair off. Dwarves are called upon to form a new headpiece, its golden waves becoming associated with fields of wheat. As agriculture splits the difference between nature and culture, the growing of cereal grains creates a link between the heavens and the earth. Rains come down from heavens, falling to the waiting earth out of which the crops grow up. Throughout these myths, we find the convergence of opposing forces, of male and female paralleling the relations between the heavens above, Thor and his thundering hammer, and earth below, Sif and her flowing fields of grain. Erotic relations of the cosmos are evoked in the growing of wheat. Through such erotic cosmic connections, the making, baking and partaking of bread become activities that offer a binding force for religious life. Religion has traditionally functioned as a medium between nature and culture, joining us to, as it simultaneously distances us from, God's trees. Myths, rituals and symbols are all predicated on natural substances and rhythms, and as humans participate in them, we are also put in sync with the cosmic order. Worship of the ancient goddesses was no different. Breads and cakes were the normal offering, with a special divine bread offered upon a table before the deities. This offering was charged with spiritual energies, and as the worshippers ate the now consecrated meal, they would gain some element of its healing powers. The goddess tradition was strong in the ancient world. Goddesses were deeply engaged with creating and nurturing the cosmic realm, and thus sustained our human relations to the heavens and to each other. Glance at many old images of Ceres, and you would not be amiss to think it was an image of Mother Mary. Long, flowing robes, gently seated and benevolent gaze. Though Ceres generally carried a staff, while Mary did not. Indeed, many early Christian images were taken from pagan imagery. Jesus as the Good Shepherd was a rendition of ritualistic images of sheep being brought to a sacrifice, the golden halo of Jesus taken from depictions of the sun god, and syncretised into a new form of worship that became seemingly unique and yet familiar to the people of Europe and beyond, where Christianity was quickly spreading. Mary takes her place along a continuity of Mother Earth goddesses. As she absorbed many of these earlier traditions, she also supplanted them, effectively and over time erasing them from the emerging histories, appearing fresh and unique. While we might be tempted to think the sacrifice of grain and bread that had been given to the earlier goddesses transferred to the Christian Eucharist to the glory of Jesus Christ, it was not always that subtle. In fact, a curious sect of Christianity, eventually labelled a heresy, emerged in the first centuries of the new religion. They were the Collyridians, mostly seen in Arabia and Thrace, which was a group of Christian women devoted to Mary and who regularly offered her sacrifices of bread. The name Collyridian refers to the type of bread they offered. They brought bread to an altar in the sacrifice and name of Mary. As one scholar writes about the importance of this tradition, in the sacred mystery of bread, every woman could view herself as possessing a portion of the creative power of the gods. For in every act of intercourse, conception and birth, the sowing of the seed, the miracle of death and life is repeated. While the Collyridians would disappear from history, a more orthodox cult of Mary would grow strong within Christianity. Mary offered opportunities to identify with femininity, motherhood and nurturing in powerful ways, between nature and culture, heavens and earth. If frankincense is the gold standard among incense varieties, wheat is it for bread flours. Historians of food tell of wheat as the king of grains, the imperial grass. Many cereal grains have been grown, milled and baked, but none other supplies everything that wheat can. Wheat is adaptable to diverse growing environments. It invades new habitats and has evolved faster and more successfully than almost any other living organism, save humans. Wheat is high in nutrient content and ultimately has great gastronomic appeal. This is especially so because of the gluten levels, which allow a coherent dough to stay together, to be shaped and baked, and ultimately to be savoured. According to some estimates, 20% of all human calories consumed around the world come from wheat flour, though in many times and places that number has been 50% and higher. Around 50 million acres of US land are used each year to produce more than 2 billion bushels of wheat. The European Union collectively and China, India and Russia all produce even more than the United States. Not all the wheat grown goes to making bread, but a vast majority of it is milled for flour, and a majority of that does end up in loaves, rolls, biscuits, pancakes and bagels. The precise origins of leavened bread are unknown. Evidence points to its beginnings in Egypt around 6,000 years ago. Due to some ancient accident, some flour and water had probably been left out for too long. Some free-floating yeast found its way to the sugars. Someone eventually noticed, perhaps befuddled by the expansion of the dough and the fermenting bubbles, and decided to cook it anyway. It's hard to imagine what that old loaf tasted like. Certainly a long way from the loaves of now, but also a marked contrast to the gruel and cakes of then. As I was looking into the origins of bread and reading books from anthropological, culinary, historical, sociological and philosophical perspectives, I noticed an interesting element in many of the studies. Curious is the way that most everyone who writes about a history of bread feels compelled, as I do here, to tell its creation story. We have no idea what actually happened in the beginning. But because we know something about the ways yeasts can interact with the starches, become sugars of ground grain mixed with water, we can take a guess. That's the gist of what we know, and so we all tell various versions of the same fictional story. A tale that begins once upon a time in ancient Egypt and carries through to the astounded observations of those who might have been around to witness that accident. There is a deep-seated human need to know origins, to pin down a time and place, and ideally a person that we can point to as the generating force of things. If we don't know, we deduce, theorise and mythologise. At the same time, we like the mystery of being unsure of its first time and place, as it adds to the appeal of the substance, as if the unknowing is evidence itself of the long-lasting power of bread and its role in human life. So bread's history is written from secular standpoints. But we writers are overtaken by the bread, by the story of bread, and draw on the supernatural to explain. British historian Philippe Fernandez Armesto's History of Food puts it this way: no convincing theory of how or why bread making began has ever been proposed. Perhaps that is the key to bread's success. It is one of those magical foods in which human mastery effects an unrecognisable change on the ingredients of the recipe. Journalist and author Michael Pollan, in a chapter on bread in his book Cooked, suggests how seeing dough rise must have seemed miraculous to those who first observed it, as if the spark of life had been breathed into it. H.E. Jacob, in 6,000 Years of Bread, ponders the wonders of baking the risen dough, imagining ancient Egyptians around the oven. In awed admiration, family and friends stood around to watch. In this chamber grew something which so far was the product of their familiar labours, but which they had now entrusted to supernatural forces over which they had no control. What Fernandez, Armesto, Pollan and Jacob are getting at is the ongoing, quasi-miraculous nature of bread itself, an object that draws us to it for smelling, for eating, for sustenance, for sharing with others, triggering our creative capacities. Bread connects us with creation itself. Pollen, as he so engagingly does with most of his studies, learns about bread by making it himself. He gains know-how with his knowledge. It's not an academic study for him, and this is part of what has made him a successful writer. He gets his hands into it. Pollen has felt, and many others of us have felt, the creative activity of making bread. The fresh baked loaf still feels like a creation ex nihilo. It's made from mud-rested form, a refutation of cosmic entropy. This run-of-the-mill provision engenders epic and mythic response. Bread is there in the beginning. As communities share stories of their most formative events, we often find bread in the midst of them. This is especially true for the history of the Jewish people. Every spring, Jews around the world sit down to share an evening in the presence of family, friends, and God. We know this ritual as the Passover Seder, a gathering that signifies the mythological makeup of the ancient Israelites and their release from captivity in the land of Egypt. This, too, is what Jesus and the disciples were celebrating at the Last Supper. And out of this sprang the Christian ritual of communion. Even so, textual and archaeological evidence suggests that Passover itself initially came from older rites that celebrated the grain harvest. Rituals like bread rarely have simple origins. Among the various foods and drinks, all with their own symbolic dimensions, matzah is perhaps the quickest trigger of Passover, the substance most connected with the annual gathering, as well as the substance most connected with the ancient stories from which it rises. Indeed, it is sometimes known as the Festival of Unleavened Bread. Matzah meets the minimal requirements of what might be called bread: some water and flour, no eggs, sugar or other additions, and certainly no yeast. Flour and water made into dough will, of course, rise in the presence of yeast. Yeast is a living single-cell fungus, and there are around 1,500 known species of it. 1 gram of yeast contains 25 billion cells, tiny little fungi that eat sugars found in grains like wheat. As the fungus eats the sugar, the byproduct is carbon dioxide gas. The microscopic carbon dioxide gas bubbles make dough expand, resulting in bread's porous texture. The little craters that deliciously hold melted butter and jam. The process of consuming sugars and producing gas is the process of fermentation, the same activity that makes alcoholic beverages like beer and wine, food products like sauerkraut, miso, yogurt and kimchi, as well as fuel for rockets and cars. So besides being quick to make, matzah fulfills another function by being pure, unfermented, not in a state of decomposition. Without yeast, the bread is flat and typically crispy, though in several food cultures, such as Iraq's, there is soft matzah. Its unleavened flatness is significant. When the Israelites were freed from slavery under Moses' leadership, they had to bring food with them, but didn't have time to let the bread rise. Leavened bread would certainly have been known to them after the years of captivity in Egypt. They quickly baked the simple dough and took it with them into the wilderness. Deuteronomy puts God's Passover command this way: "You are not to eat any hametz, leavened food, with it. For 7 days you are not to eat with it matzo. You are to eat with it matzo, the bread of affliction. For you came out of the land of Egypt in haste. Thus you will remember the day you left the land of Egypt as long as you live." Matzo thus helps signal the liberation from slavery, the start of a new life, and the movement towards the promised land. Matzo is called poor man's bread and bread of affliction. Its simplicity evokes humility. As it is eaten, participants in the Seder read from the Haggadah, the ritual manual that provides prayers and stories to help guide and remind the observant. Describing the place of the ritual observance of this ancient story, The Jewish historian Yosef Hayim Yerushalmi looks at the role of remembrance, Zachor, through the Hebrew Bible, and says that the memory enacted in the Seder is not recollection which still preserves a sense of distance, but reactualization. The Talmud puts it directly and forcefully. In each and every generation, let each person regard himself as though he had emerged from Egypt. In the eating, the praying, the drinking, and the communing, the present-day community begins the evening in bondage. When they're liberated and finally redeemed, eating is remembering the past made real to us through the palate. Bread stuck with the Israelites. Perhaps during their time in Egypt, the growing and baking of cereal grains becoming deeply ingrained in their cultural life and prompted them to make bread an integral aspect of several rituals. Sometime after the Exodus, the grain product became associated with the Torah through the ritual of Shavuot. The Festival of Weeks began as a grain harvest, Exodus 34:22, that ultimately overlaid the agricultural ceremony with God's giving of the Torah to Moses. The founding story in this case tells of the Israelites wandering in the Sinai desert on the way to the Promised Land. They stopped for some time at the base of Mount Sinai while Moses climbed the mountain to commune with God. God spoke and gave Moses and the people the Torah, the teachings and law that sustained Jews for the next several millennia. To celebrate this monumental event, in the ancient ritual of Shavuot, the Israelites used 2 loaves of wheat bread, as well as other first fruits, as an offering to God. In contemporary versions of the ritual, all-night Torah study might occur, and the Book of Ruth is read, though curiously there is not a lot of agreement on why Ruth. As the Torah became embedded in the social life of the people and rituals were structured for offering and worship to the one true God, bread continued to be present. The laws surrounding the tabernacle, the main place of worship through the wilderness, and ultimately the temple in Jerusalem, included space for bread. Alongside the altar of burnt offering and altar of incense, God also instructed that they are to keep a showbread upon a table near the altar. This bread, Chechem Halanim, is the bread of the presence, for it is to always be in the presence of God. 12 loaves were laid out during the week and changed every Sabbath. The leftovers were to be eaten by the priests. One set of instructions in Leviticus states that the bread was to be accompanied by cups of frankincense. It is not clear that the bread was unleavened. The initial biblical accounts do not mention this, but one can't help wondering about the priestly task of eating week-old bread. Then again, according to Talmudic sources, the matriarch Sarah was able to make bread that stayed fresh from Friday to Friday, and the manna that fell from the heavens on Fridays during the wilderness wanderings would keep through the Sabbath. So perhaps here too a small weekly miracle occurred to preserve the perishable matter. Ancient customs often carry ancient secrets. According to 1 Chronicles, the Kohathites were the clan charged with taking care of the showbread. As with the frankincense recipes kept by the Abtinus family or the bread-making skills of the Poilain family, it seems the Kohathites also kept secret instructions for the bread recipes and preparations. Years later, the great Kabbalistic mystic Rabbi Isaac Luria encouraged the use of 12 breads on the household Sabbath table as a replica of the temple and as a symbolic reference to the unspoken name of God. The name can be seen or invoked but not uttered. On Luria's table, by the way, would have been 12 loaves of pitta, and a Moroccan explanation of the challah says, the bread contained within it divine secrets. While the showbread was baked to the ancient temple, and thus specific rituals surrounding it disappeared with the destruction of the temple in 70 CE, bread sacrifices continue. At 4:30 every morning, on the Lower East Side of Manhattan, A rabbi arrives at Kossos Be'ali to bless the day's dough and to make a burnt offering of the challah. Contrary to popular understandings, challah is not necessarily the eggy, sweet, braided loaf you find at your local grocer's, but has its roots in the Hebrew scriptures and refers to an offering of the first part of kneaded dough that is given to a priest. It is a mitzvah, a command. There are several layers to this command, many passed through rabbinical literature, and one of them is meant for the challah sacrifice, to trigger the bread of presence and the offerings involved there. Another is to always remember our reliance on God, from whom the food comes in the first place. Today, challah still refers to the sacrificial portion, but it also names a diverse range of bread types, standing for a diverse Jewry. It is probably only since the 15th century that the braided bread has been used specifically on the Sabbath, and this began among the Ashkenazi in Germany, most likely adapted from the baking practices of non-Jewish neighbours. Sephardic Jews have continued to use flatbread for their Sabbath challah. Challah loaves may be flavoured with poppy seeds, figs, raisins, caraway or apples, and sweetened with honey or sugar. During Purim, some Ashkenazi will shape it into a rose after a traditional medieval liturgical song, The Rose of Jacob, while the Moroccan Jewish community at Purim bakes hard-boiled eggs into the loaf to resemble Hammam's eyes. With their symbolic dimensions of liberation, purity, memory and offering to God, specially flavoured and shaped breads create a wide range of meanings for Jewish people. Bread preserves history. A companion is someone we share bread with. That's what the word companion literally means, from kom, meaning together, and panis, meaning bread. When company comes over, we break out the bread. Bread is a pervasive symbol of being together, of gathering, of community, a symbol that we engage, chew, taste, swallow, and digest in the presence of others. Historians of social life are clear that commensality, eating together, has been vital to ongoing political power and peaceful coexistences. A Moroccan proverb tells us, by bread and salt we are united. In the first few centuries of the Christian Church, BYOB was the norm. Worshippers brought their own bread and wine, contributing to the community life at large, sharing with companions. The elements were blessed through prayers and the faithful ate and drank. Whatever was left would be distributed to the catechumens, those undergoing a preparation course for admittance to the church, but not yet full members, and members who were absent. These leftovers were initially called the eulogia. A eulogy is a blessing, but in this initial usage, it is about the object blessed, which in many early uses was specifically communion bread. Before there were words of blessing, there was bread of blessing. By the 4th century, Christians were sending eulogia to each other as symbols of their union, their life as the body of Christ. In ordination and canonization ceremonies within the Roman Catholic tradition today, loaves of bread are often passed from one party to another as symbols of power and blessing. The Eucharist eventually became so central and centralised that not just any bread would do. It needed to be authorised and maintained by the clergy, and thus grew the altar bread tradition that protected the quality of the breads, ensuring they were made with pure natural water of wheat flour only and baked. Christianity would not exist without bread, or if it did, the tradition would be in a form unrecognisable to Christians then and now. Jesus was born in Bethlehem, the town's name literally meaning the house of bread. In Hebrew, the term lechem is generally translated as bread, but also is used to refer to food in general throughout the Bible. Similar parallels are found in several languages. The translators of Proverbs 28:19 put it, "He who tills his land will have plenty of food, lechem, but he who follows empty pursuits will have poverty in plenty." Bread becomes a synecdoche of food and connected to good life. This relation of the part to the whole unfolds to encompass an even larger idea, as bread becomes a symbol that stands for life itself. Into the house of bread is born the bread of life. The Jesus of John's Gospel says, I am the living bread which came down out of heaven. If any man eat of this bread, he shall live forever. Yea, and the bread which I will give is my flesh, for the life of the world. Throughout the Gospels, Jesus refers to himself in the language of bread, perhaps calling to mind the cult of Ceres, as well as the showbread and challah. Ultimately, at the Last Supper, Jesus identifies himself with the bread and wine. With his disciples, he observes the Passover Seder, taking the bread and wine, telling them to eat of it and saying, Do this in remembrance of me. As with the Jewish tradition, Christian memory is not some type of thinking that we do with our brains. It is something we enact through our bodies. Memory is ingested, chewed and swallowed. Early Christians drew many of their myths, rituals and symbols from their Jewish and pagan precursors, and what came to be known as the Christian Eucharist or Holy Communion was no exception. From the ancient mother goddess traditions of Demeter, Ceres and Isis and the showbread of the temple came a practice of offering bread upon an altar table. Several prominent early Christian theologians such as Ignatius of Antioch, Irenaeus, Ambrose of Milan and St. Augustine discussed the power of the Eucharistic bread to effect healing and even ward off death and lead toward immortality. We might easily read this as metaphorical language today, but in the time and place in which they were writing, the distance between the magical and metaphorical was not so easily discerned. Whether it is today is another question. Early Christianity itself is full of accounts of miraculous effects of the Eucharist warding off evil, blessing and curing. In many ways, the notion of the bread and wine functioning like an amulet dissipated over time, but many miraculous events were linked to the substance. Throughout history, Christians have used the activity of eating bread and drinking wine to remember, to signal their devotion, and to join together as the body of Christ. There is a presence in the bread, and as the community takes communion, we are bound to the past, bound to Jesus Christ, and bound to each other in the present moment. The first explicit theological statement by the Christian Church on the presence of the divine within the food substances was given at the Fourth Lateran Council in 1215. In this church, Jesus Christ himself is both priest and sacrifice, and his body and blood are really contained in the sacrament of the altar under the species of bread and wine, the bread being transubstantiated into the body and the wine into the blood by the power of God, so that to carry out the mystery of unity we ourselves receive from him, the body. This statement, eventually known as the doctrine of transubstantiation, merely reaffirmed what lay people had been assuming in their practices for centuries. What is stated here is that this most basic of foods, ubiquitous in its form across the known cultures of the day, became divine within the specificities of the Mass. And by eating this bread, believers take divinity into themselves. 13th century mystic Mechthild of Magdeburg had Eucharistically ecstatic visions of God recorded in her work, The Flowing Light of Divinity. She says, Yet I, least of all souls, take him in my hand, eat him and drink him, and do with him what I will. Living on bread alone became a mark of piety through much of Christian history. The Carthusians, for example, fasted 3 times a week, during which they would take only bread, water and salt. This is not to say that very many Christians ate only bread and water, but the sustenance of bread alone is a key element in the hagiographies of many saints. St. Jerome, the 4th century historian who gave us many accounts of early church events, tells of the life of a 3rd century desert father called St. Paul the Hermit. According to Jerome's account, a raven would come every day to bring the ageing ascetic a half loaf of bread, and thus he was sustained for many years. This component of his life was so key that the image of the raven and bread has become the standard depiction in St. Paul the Hermit's iconography. Once, when St. Anthony paid a visit, the raven brought a whole loaf, and a humorous tale follows. Anthony and Paul gave thanks for the Lord's loaf. Then, rising to partake of the meagre food, they dispute who should be the one to break the bread, each wishing to show the other humility and hospitality. Their argument lasts the whole day, with Paul saying Anthony should break it, because he is the host in this circumstance, while Anthony defers to Paul's age, wanting to offer the bread to his senior brother. As evening rolls around, they decide that they should each grasp one end of the loaf and pull, and so they do, with each one feasting on their morsels and then keeping vigil through the night. That evening proved to be the final one of St. Paul the Hermit's time on earth. Into the Middle Ages, pious Christians, many of them women, went for long periods subsisting on the Eucharist alone, a diet of bread and wine. Mystical visions occurred as the bread and wine would transform into the human body of Christ before their eyes, transubstantiation taken to its extreme, as their physical bodies became emaciated. The obsessions of these mystics could become so ingrained in their minds and bodies that modern historians have considered some of these to be cases of anorexia nervosa. Caroline Bynum, one of the most knowledgeable medieval European historians of our day, puts it this way: eating God in the host was both a sweet tasting that focused and transcended all hunger, and on occasion for paramystical phenomena of the most bizarre and exuberant sort. Catherine of Genoa, for one, was so desirous of God's love that she went through long periods of fasting, ingesting only bread and wine. As a result, bread became a constant refrain in her language. Hunger was a metaphor for desire in general, satisfied only by the bread of God. Let us imagine, she says, that the whole world there was but one bread and that it could satisfy the hunger of all. She acknowledges the metaphorical quality of her writing, while at the same time she was physically partaking of the communion, but very little else, leaving her with constant bodily afflictions, convulsions, feelings of extreme heat and cold, and trance experiences. It should be made clear that for Catherine, as for much of medieval spirituality, such diets were never undertaken simply for the individual, him or herself. Instead, they are set within the physical spiritual action of service to others, as mystics like Catherine often worked with the sick in hospitals and helped feed those with few resources. Fasting was social, spiritual and physical, all at once. Questions about the material substance of bread and the presence of God within it have been evolving over the centuries. At times, the metaphorical language about bread gets ignored, leaving only literalism. In a 1995 letter writing from the Vatican as prefect of the Sacred Congregation for the Doctrine of the Faith, Cardinal Joseph Ratzinger stated, Given the centrality of the celebration of the Eucharist in the life of the priest, candidates for the priesthood who are affected by celiac disease or suffer from alcoholism or similar conditions may not be admitted to holy orders. Wheat bread and alcoholic wine are the Roman Catholic approved ingredients of the Eucharist, and there is to be no substitute for them. No gluten-free bread, no alcohol-free wine. Thus, people who have had bad reactions to these substances need not apply. In his letter, Ratzinger reiterated Canon Law 924.2, which states, special hosts, quibus glutinum ablatum est, that are gluten-free, are invalid matter for the celebration of the Eucharist. As gluten intolerance has become a widely known medical condition, the symbolic tradition has had to be revisited, but the Vatican has reaffirmed its long-standing doctrinal position. Nonetheless, in broad, creative Catholic fashion, many parishes have found their ways around the rigid canon law. Practice always proves more pliable and more interesting than doctrine, and so some parishes have allowed communicants to receive communion under the form of wine only. Others have turned to low-gluten wafers. In fact, the Benedictine Sisters of Perpetual Adoration in Clyde, Missouri, have become the go-to suppliers for practicing Catholics with gluten intolerance. The Sisters began in 1874 when a small group of women left Switzerland and came to the United States, founding a monastery in Clyde that ministered to a German immigrant population. There the sisters taught, ran an orphanage and eventually started a farm that provided food for the community at large. In 1910 they began to make altar breads, initially using a single gas stove, turning to electric stoves by 1920 and increasing production with new technologies up until the present day. In the past century, an estimated 5 billion wafers have been distributed across the world for use in Catholic Mass, and they are now the world's largest religious producer of altar breads. In 2003, the sisters began making low-gluten wafers, and these have proven to be highly popular. I contacted them to learn more about this product, and they told me that they have been overwhelmed by demand for them, and that their customer list is over 6,000, primarily in North America, but in other parts of the world as well. In conjunction with the US Conference of Catholic Bishops, they came up with a recipe that uses a wheat starch with most of the gluten removed. It is still wheat only and thus fulfills the Roman Catholic dogma, but the gluten content is less than 0.01%, making it safe for most people who suffer from gluten intolerance. On the other end of the spectrum, Protestants have in general been a good deal looser with interpretations and practices than the Vatican. As part of the Protestant Reformation, Martin Luther, John Calvin, and others pruned the official sacraments of the Church from 7 down to 2: baptism and communion. These reformers, like most reformers of religious history, have believed that too much ritual creates hierarchy and fosters a spiritual focus that is external instead of internal. As a result, the doctrine of transubstantiation also became watered down. Luther still understood the presence of Christ to be in the bread and wine, but they did not become the actual body. Later theologians would call Luther's view consubstantiation. Calvin, Ulrich Zwingli, and other theologians at the same time offered their own versions of what happens to the bread and wine during communion, moving further and further from earlier church doctrine, as they intended to show their own uniqueness in relation to the others, and in ways that distance themselves from anything that might seem superstitious or overly reliant on magic. The mystery made safe. Today's Protestant denominations, stemming from the various offshoots that rapidly multiplied after Luther and Calvin, have trimmed the sacraments to such a degree that even communion, that most central rite throughout most of Christianity, is not often celebrated. When it is, adherence to wheat bread and wine are not necessary. Due to a broad temperance movement in the 19th century and the preservation and pasteurisation advances invented by people like the Methodist Thomas Bramwell Welch, grape juice became standard as a replacement for wine at some Protestant communion tables in the United States and United Kingdom. Online businesses like celebrantcommunion.com offer boxed sets of communion wafers and pre-filled disposable communion cups with grape juice, while Amazon's grocery section sells a number of boxed wafers from different companies. Gluten-free wafers are also available, made of rice and potato flour, 0% wheat. The distance we have come from the medieval view of communion can be seen in the reviewer's tongue-in-cheek comments on the Amazon site. A reviewer with a screen name of Cypress Green says of a communion wafer box, "Order several boxes of Jesus and he'll help you out with that unsightly double chin, just as you prayed." And Angela says simply, "I eat them because they're a good snack." Yet, even if the miracles are rendered benign and the wonder proven to be nothing more than a stark white sponge, bread's creative facilities have morphed and spread, adapting to multiple contexts. Bread has become so widespread throughout the Christian tradition that there is a profusion of breads for various seasonal rituals. There is the bobalki in Slovakia at Christmas, Rosca de Reyes for Three Kings Day, Epiphany, in Mexico, Lagana for Greek Orthodox Lent, hot cross buns for Good Friday in the United Kingdom, Kulich for Russian Easter, and the United Church of Christ. First Churches of Northampton, Massachusetts have recently introduced the local recipe of fig bread for their congregation during Advent. The process of making leavened bread includes a step known as the proof stage, in which the dough ferments and rises to what will be its final form before baking. There are minted proofs for coins, liquor proofs which tell of alcohol content, printing proofs for book pages after their final fermentation, proof texts which argue theological points, and legal proofs for solving crimes. A proof relies on the activity of proving something, probing, putting it to the test, creating a measurement by which something might be judged, a body of evidence deemed worthy and ready. which all presupposes some crime, some doubt, some lingering questions. So with bread, the proofing allows the baker to test the results of the many processes leading up to the ultimate time in the oven, looking at, touching and smelling the loaf. Proofs for bread, like proofs for God, require some substantiation. The English word proof finds its cognate noun in Spanish as prueba and the related verb probar. In French, it is prueba, in Italian, provare. In Spanish class, a student might take a prueba and probar in generally translated as to test or to try. At the same time, if you want to taste some food or drink, you will sabor or gustar, but in its transitive form, you might probar. As with this Spanish connection, in English, the words testing and tasting share origins. Taste test is a redundant phrase. Though mostly obsolete now, to taste something used to mean not only testing and trying, but also experiencing and feeling. The proof is in the pudding. We even attach ethical and aesthetical value to our tongues. To say something is in bad taste means that a social code has been violated. Someone who has refined his or her sense of decor has good taste. It is not just that a thing tasted can be good or bad, but that taste belongs to the possessor of the tongue. The collection of objects in her house becomes proof that she has good taste. Bread is proofed. It is probed, tried, tested and tasted, as it is created. In so doing, the bread tries us, tests our patience, our attention to detail, our ability to work well with others. The activity of making bread, of mixing, blending, kneading, forming, rising, shaping, proofing and baking, which is to say nothing of the tilling, sowing, tending, fertilising, reaping and grinding, is fraught with struggle. The Islamic Sufi poet Jalaluddin Rumi has a wonderful poem called Bread Making that intertwines the activity of lovemaking with warriors in battle. Warring and lovemaking are metaphorically applicable to the bread-making process, a great mutual embrace taking place between God and humans. And just as the bread of the Bible is the stuff and staff of life, we also find the bread of wickedness, the bread of deceit, and the bread of adversity. Bread is a battle. One person who knows the double-sided dimension of bread is the Jesuit priest Greg Boyle. Father Boyle became pastor of Dolores Mission Church in 1986, one of the poorest parishes in Los Angeles, situated among the largest public housing projects in the western United States. A multitude of gangs have operated in the area, and Boyle has buried numerous young men during his time there. He has tried a number of tactics to relieve some of the social problems of the area, peace treaties between warring gangs, pleading with local communities to employ more young people, opening spaces for gang members to hang out, all to varying degrees of success. He uses mottos like "jobs, not jails," and "nothing stops a bullet like a job." In 1992, violent uprisings erupted across Los Angeles following the acquittal of Los Angeles policemen who had been videoed beating motorist Rodney King. At that time, with some start-up funding from a movie producer, Boyle created Homeboy Industries. Their first industry was a bakery. For 2 decades now, former gang members, oftentimes from rival gangs, have mixed and kneaded and baked bread together. This has given many young men and women a new chance in life, and a number of them go on to finish school or find other permanent work. Homeboy Industries has added a number of other businesses, employing more than 400 people a year. It is now the largest gang intervention program in the country. Homeboy Industries is about many things. A better life through bread is only a part of it. Yet the effects of bread making can be seen in the recreation of key social facets. The Navajo also know something of the bread of affliction and wanderings in the wilderness. What has emerged over the past century and a half is a reverence for fry bread. For many Navajo, this has become sacred bread that honours and remembers their displacement from their ancestral homeland, Dinatah, in northeastern Arizona, to a less hospitable land in New Mexico. In the late 19th century, the US cavalry forced the Navajo to make what came to be called the Long Walk, more than 300 miles across desert landscapes. Many died of starvation because the rations given to them were often rancid. What seems to have sustained the Navajo was the combination of white flour, sugar, salt, and lard. Out of these meagre supplies, fry bread was born, preserving the people through their dislocation. Many now understand the bread to be one of the more vital symbols for contemporary Native Americans, especially as it has become a key part of powwows and it signifies resistance against oppression. Novelist Sherman Alexie says, "Fry bread is the story of our survival." Yet this story too unfolds into more battle. As one might imagine from the ingredients, fry bread is a deeply unhealthy food. The USDA estimates an average plate-sized piece has 700 calories and 25 grams of fat. With high rates of obesity and diabetes among many Native American tribes, a number of activists have campaigned against it. American Indian writer Suzanne Shone Hayo wrote in 2005 that fry bread is to blame for diabetes, hypertension and obesity and is the cause of many deaths in general among Native Americans. Her reasoned plea was met with adversity as many came to its defence, feeling she had violated a sacred tradition. The battle continues. The eloquent writer on food, M.F.K. Fisher, also sees the bisection of baking and battles and the physical struggles of love. In the midst of food shortages during World War II, Fisher published a practical book called How to Cook a Wolf. She somewhat bemoans the contemporary lack of know-how for bread making, but espouses and encourages a return to its form, for the sake of economy if nothing else. If taken seriously, bread making has great side effects through its ritualistic, hypnotic motions, like a dance from some ancient ceremony. It leaves you filled with one of the world's sweetest smells, but it takes a lot of time. Make it, for probably there is no chiropractic treatment, no yoga exercise, no hour of meditation in a music-throbbing chapel that will leave you emptier of bad thoughts than this homely ceremony of making bread. Writer James Baldwin in The Fire Next Time had this to say: "To be sensual, I think, is to respect and rejoice in the force of life itself, and to be present in all that one does, from the effort of loving to the making of bread." Bread making, like ritual making, is born of the body. Bread making is a ritual at once secular and sacred, full of love and battle, testing and tasting. The Hebrew word used for bread in the Bible, lechem, looks like it should share a root with the word for fighting or doing battle, lacham. It does not, but though the words have different origins, the connection is inherent. Love making can look like wrestling, and bread making could be confused with either. While researching for this chapter, I came across a book published in 1944 called 6,000 Years of Bread, Its Holy and Unholy History, by H.E. Jacob, mentioned earlier. The book was favourably reviewed at the time in prominent places like the New York Times and the Wall Street Journal, and is often referred to now in studies on bread, though usually with a grain of salt. While Jacob's research on bread initially was of interest to me, what became more interesting was Jacob's own life. Heinrich Edward Jacob was born in Berlin in 1889 during a time of increasing freedom for Jews within the dominantly Christian continent of Europe. Following the Enlightenment, nation-states in the 18th and 19th centuries began the process of emancipation as Jews struggled for and gained relative freedom and rights as citizens. The Fourth Lateran Council of 1215, the very same one that enacted the doctrine of the transubstantiation of bread and wine at the Eucharist, had required Jews and Muslims in Europe to wear particular clothing to distinguish them from Christians. This had been but one part of centuries full of discriminatory laws and attitudes that forced non-Christians to live in particular sections of towns. The term ghetto comes from this practice, without any significant civil rights, often with imposing tax structures and occasionally forced conversion and baptism. Beginning with the French Revolution in 1789, national laws were changed in Europe, and Jews began to play prominent roles in the socio-economic life of cities and countries. Berlin became one of the great centres of Jewish life in Europe. With these new freedoms, Jacob was able to gain an education in literature, philosophy and music, work as a journalist for a notable newspaper, and publish books on the histories of coffee, Mozart, film and Johann Strauss. The rise of National Socialism changed all that. reversing laws back to a previous stage and in much more severe terms. With the Nazi annexation of Austria in 1938, Jacob was arrested while working in Vienna and sent to concentration camps in Dachau and then Buchenwald. His writings, including the 1930 bestseller Blood and Celluloid, were blacklisted. His ongoing research notes through the 1930s were kept hidden by his wife, Dora. Due to some key connections, and especially through the work of his wife, he was released a year later and immigrated to the United States, where he lived out his life as a writer and journalist. When he returned to his writing, settling into some space at the New York Public Library and Columbia University, the work to which he turned was 6,000 Years of Bread. He wrote in German, and the book was translated into English and published not long before Dachau and Buchenwald were liberated. When I learned about Jacob's life, something unsettled me, that he, a prisoner of some of the most notorious concentration camps of Nazi Germany, whose own life was almost wholly destroyed at the time, should turn to writing a history of bread during the years of the Holocaust seemed either escapism or something more profound. The answer, I think, comes in the final section of his book. After 350 pages of accounting for the history of bread in the Western world, Jacob turns to the rise of the Nazis and World War II. Here, Jacob does not make much mention of the anti-Semitic rules and regulations brought on by Hitler's powers, but he does attend to legal and political actions like the Reich Hereditary Farm Act of 1933, and to Hitler's general duping of the peasants, what Jacob calls the bread-producing class. The Nazis systematically starved the vast majority of the lands they'd conquered, especially taking wheat from the lands and funneling it back to feed those within the party system. At the same time, the Nazis mixed bread flour with potato flour and who knows what else, and gave this unwholesome mixture back to those they conquered. In the final 25 pages, Jacob argues that the roots of both world wars must be understood in agrarian terms. These wars were at heart about hunger, about feeding great masses of people, and bread is the staple through which this can be achieved. Jacob quotes Herbert Hoover from 1943. World peace means a piece of bread. The first word in a war is spoken by the guns, but the last word has always been spoken by bread. For Jacob, Hoover here sums up the evidence of his argument. Jacob's book moves from the personal to the political and back again. The final 2 paragraphs of 6,000 Years of Bread are worth quoting here. In the Buchenwald concentration camp, we had no real bread at all. What was called bread was a mixture of potato flour, peas and sawdust. The inside was the colour of lead, the crust looked and tasted like iron, the thing sweated water like the brow of a tormented man. Nevertheless, we called it bread, in memoriam of the real bread we had formerly eaten. We loved it and could scarcely wait for it to be distributed among us. Many died there without ever tasting real bread again. I still live. It seems remarkable to me that I can eat real bread. Bread is holy and bread is profane. It is most wonderful when all can have it. In the 6,000 years that men and bread have lived side by side, there have often been moments when each of God's creatures had all they wanted, and they were filled, the Bible says. No simpler words can be written to describe happiness, satisfaction, gratitude. Jacob's account reminded me of another prisoner of Buchenwald, Elie Wiesel. In his book Night, Wiesel tells of the horrors of being taken to the concentration camps and how people clamoured over each other for chunks of bread thrown into boxcars headed for the camps. One man kills his own father for a piece, only to be killed by another. But I'm also reminded of the Holocaust stories in which fragments of the precious commodity of daily bread rations were saved up through the week for the Sabbath. Yaffa Eliach in Hasidic Tales of the Holocaust tells of a Czech teenager named Inyak, a prisoner at Mauthausen, who hid 1 crumb of bread each day in his uniform. On Sabbath at dusk, after a long day of back-breaking slave labour, Ignac would manage to wash his hands, seek a corner where he would not attract too much attention, and celebrate his third Sabbath meal. He chewed the morsels and remembered the Sabbath of his childhood. The peace and tranquillity of the Sabbath would be upon him, and the hell of Mauthausen would be overpowered by the Sabbath bliss. Transcendence occurs through the crumb of bad bread. The memories of real physical spaces and ancestors are enacted in the ritualized eating. If bread is so ingrained in world history, as Jacob argues, and it is so deeply seated in religious consciousness, what happens when a community of the faithful comes from a culture that does not have bread at its base? What use is a metaphor when there is no physical reality on which to ground it? What happens to beliefs and behaviours when cultural specifics meet pan-cultural religious traditions? Is it the stuff itself that is central, or the ritual surrounding it? Or can such matters be separated? As we come to the end of this chapter, tensions between the local and the global meet the already noted tensions between nature and culture and the sacred and the profane. The worldwide Anglican Church has been asking some of these questions with regard to communion. In 2007, the Church's liturgical department issued a report responding to increased needs to provide substitutes for wheat bread and alcoholic wine, since Christians in many parts of the world do not have access to these substances. Sometimes Christians live in dominantly Islamic nations in which the sale of alcohol is prohibited and thus wine is hard to come by. Or Anglican communities work with alcoholics and the presence of alcohol hinders ministry. Or wheat is simply not the staple crop it is in the Western world, and rice is the common grain. Not only might wheat bread be difficult to come by in this case, but the whole metaphor of the staff of life also becomes meaningless in such settings. The Anglican report basically reconfirmed that wheat bread and alcoholic wine are best, but that the final practice should be dealt with in specific regions on a local level. What gets used instead? In Uganda, during the years of Idi Amin's ruthless reign, it was difficult to obtain wine and bread, so Anglicans used banana juice, passion juice, or Coca-Cola in place of wine and biscuits for bread. During the height of the US economic embargo against Cuba, churches on the island began to brew their own wine from honey, fruit and grain. In war-torn Sudan, bread has often been unavailable, and so cassava is eaten. There are Polynesian accounts of using coconut, and Hawaiians who use poi instead of bread. East Asian Protestant churches in Los Angeles have used rice for communion, not because they can't find bread, but because that's what was used in their homeland, in places where bread does not have comparable symbolic powers. The Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, Mormons, uses water instead of wine, along with bread. Similar circumstances affect the worldwide Jewish community. There is a Tunisian saying, Shabbat is not Shabbat without couscous. Across North African Jewish communities, couscous is a staple food, though its use for Passover is debated. There are many Sephardic couscous recipes readily available for the Seder, but Ashkenazi traditions generally don't include it, and many have argued that it is a pasta and thus chametz. But again, doctrine and culture do not really align. Throughout southern and eastern Asia, where bread grains are not regularly grown, there are various festivities that celebrate the planting and harvesting of rice, and it is this grass and rice bread grain that is the staple, and not bread grain, that is the staple. In India, rice is associated with the goddess Lakshmi, who is celebrated every autumn during Diwali, with rice playing a key role as part of her devotional offerings, Lakshmi Puja. In China, rice was one of the 5 sacred grains in ancient mythologies, and in Japan, the popular rice deity Inari Okami is associated with fertility, and offerings are made in the form of rice and the fermented rice drink sake. The deities need to eat, as do the communicants and companions, and where bread is not a mainstay, rice generally is. Naan, chapati, rai, shami, communion wafers, matzo, tortilla, roti, wonder, sourdough, injera, pitta. All these can be called bread in an intelligible way. Bread can be flat or fluffy. black or white, soft or hard, moist or dry, airy or dense, formed into small or large units, eaten alone or as a utensil for other foods. The basic ingredients are a little water and some kind of flour. Typical additions include yeast, salt and sugar, sometimes egg, sometimes fruit or nuts. The dough can be kneaded in order to rise or pounded flat and then fried or baked. Not only is bread a useful substance to use as a tool for comparison and contrast, as its making and eating is evident across a number of religious traditions, but it also works well metaphorically for religion itself. Among other things, bread is a concept, says William Rubel in his Global History of Bread. An invention of culture. Bread works the tongue and the mind, makes us think and gives us the fuel for thinking. The perfect vehicle, Apollonia Polaine says, to talk about really essential things. The simple stuff of ground and baked grain mixed with water and one or two other ingredients becomes a powerful tool to carry on across the great reaches of continents and cultures, inventions and ideologies, all of which is not unlike the objects and activities of religious tradition. But there is a caveat. Bread is not universal. Bread connects us politically, cosmically, erotically and gastronomically, but its religious applications make it distinct from the other widespread objects we've seen in the previous chapters. So while stones, incense, drums and crosses are prominently found in religious traditions around the globe, bread's religious use remains significantly Judeo-Christian. Muslims, Buddhists, Hindus, Taoists and various animists may eat bread, but rarely does it find its way into so prominent a place as it does in the traditions of Judaism and Christianity. Even when we find it in multiple places, there are specific and special rules and customs accompanying its making, baking and partaking. Widespread and everyday that it is, bread does not appear everywhere in spite of its all too common epithet. And so religion is like bread. It is an invention, a concept that changes from place to place, time to time. As I will explain further in the conclusion to this book, it has some basic ingredients, myths, rituals and symbols, to name but 3 of the most prominent, and serves certain purposes: social cohesion, connection with supernatural forces, a sense of order and purpose. But when we get down to the nitty-gritty of it, the similarities between traditions can be difficult to sniff out, which means that against popular wisdom, I find it important to empirically state that not all religions are the same. They do not want the same thing in the same way and are not structured for those purposes in the same way. Ideally, they might seek to offer a better life for their adherents, but how they go about this is different in each circumstance. We can say they are the same only if we remain in abstraction. If we look at a basket of pumpernickel and pitta, chapati and challah, we can say that that's a bread basket. If we look at Islam, Christianity and Shinto, we can say those are religions, but the specifications are crucial to attend to. Religion, like bread, is a useful term, just as art, literature, history and culture are useful terms. We use these terms as concepts and conventions, even if what they point to is an invention. They help us live and offer us shorthand accounts for our experiences. Yet we must remain aware of the limits of our comparisons. Be careful of the crunch when we're ready to chew.